Thank you, Paul, too, so much for hosting me, for setting this up. I'm thrilled to be here. I'm staggered that you're all here. I mean, it's 7 o'clock on 7:15 now on a Wednesday evening, for heaven's sake. So thank you all so much for coming. As I understand it, you are pretty much all reading the Confessions at the moment, and most of you for the first time, yes? And I have to say, you have my sympathy. Because I read the Confessions for the first time when I was actually rather older than most of you are now. And I had no idea what was going on. And not only did I have no idea what was going on, I found it pretty tedious. And part of, over time, I hasten to add I've changed my mind. I'm not here under false pretenses. I now find it thrilling. But I gradually realized that part of the reason I found the Confessions so hard, so difficult to read, was it's not like anything else. There is nothing that you can, there is no literary context that you can bring to the Confessions and have a moment and say, oh yeah, I know what's going on now. And probably everything you've heard about the Confessions before you started reading hasn't helped either. So one of the ways people talk about the Confessions is the first Western autobiography, which is actually rubbish twice over, because it's neither the first, nor is it an autobiography. It has autobiographical material in it, of course, you all know that, but in no way is it an autobiography in the way that we think of autobiography. So another thing you may think about it is that it's theology. I thought, well, yes, of course, there's theology there, but it's theology done on the fly and integrated into this life story so that a lot of the time you don't know where one begins and the other ends. So a subtitle of this lecture might need to have been How I Learned to Love the Confessions, since, as I say, I really didn't care for it much first time around. And what I'm going to try to do this evening for you guys is to suggest ways into the Confessions around the theme of language. And I'll just say now, since language is going to be super important in this lecture, does everyone have a handout, or at least have a view over a handout? And if they don't, are there any left at the back? No, they're all gone. In that case, my apologies. But try to lean over or stretch. Is everyone? Yeah, that would be great. I can send you a copy. Okay, whether you have a handout or not, I think one way into the Confessions, very specifically around the theme of language, is to think about how Augustine describes himself, what he's doing. And the first thing is, we're pretty confident that he calls the Confessions the Confessions. You can't always be sure of that with ancient texts. Often the titles they go by are attached later on by people who copy them, or by people who read them, or by people who report on them. But Augustine signals the word confession so often in this book, and he refers to it as the Confessions when he reviews all his writings at the end of his life. We assume this is the title he wanted. And so what does Confessions literally mean. It's nothing to do with going to confession, or very little to do with going to confession in 397 CE, which is when he's writing these things, because there isn't yet an established practice of confession in the church at this stage. So you can be confident of that. Confession's derived from a Latin verb. It's a prefix con, and the verb is fateor. And fateor means I say, or I acknowledge, that's all. Con means with, as a prefix. So put it together, confiteor, the noun is confessio. It means just speaking with. And that's absolutely key in the Confessions. Even if you've only read page 1 of the Confessions, you know that this is a conversation with God. Augustine's speaking with God, and secondarily with his readers, including us. So that notion of conversation you need to hold in mind through the whole Confessions as you read them, that this is, in a sense, a living document. It's presented as a conversation, and it's not the other thing that's really important to realize is it's not a one-sided conversation. This isn't like listening to a phone call from Augustine to God. And you can only hear his end of the line, and perhaps you occasionally hear a mumble or a crackle on the other end. God is speaking back to Augustine in the Confessions as well. How's he doing that? He's doing that through the Scriptures, through his word in the Scriptures. That's really important about the Confessions too, to realize that the other side of Augustine's conversation is Scripture. And again, Augustine assimilates his own voice so closely to Scripture, sometimes it's hard to tell where one begins and the other ends. That's really important too. After all, again, if you've only read page 1, you will know he starts the Confessions by asking how he is to invite God into him. And that's part of what he's trying to do in this conversation. So that's handout number 1, for those who don't have a handout, the literal meaning of the Confessions. Speaking with, conversation. Augustine also tells us at the beginning of book 10, which you may not have reached yet, what he thinks he's doing. And that's the passage at handout 2. He says, "Truth it is that I want to do in my heart by confession in your presence, and with my pen before many witnesses." So, in my heart by confession in your presence, you, of course, there is God, and with my pen before many witnesses. And doing truth is a phrase that's just as extraordinary in Latin as it is in English. But that's the most concise description he can make of this project. At the beginning of book 10, the biographical material or autobiographical material, such as it is done. And he is gathering himself together and thinking and showing you, us all, how he's thinking about this project. And so this statement is the way he's gathering together the threads that unite the two halves of the Confessions. And that thread is striving towards truth, trying to do truth, whatever exactly that means. Clearly, you have to think very hard about language if you're going to do truth. one of the running themes in Augustine's thought is the inadequacy of language, the imperfections of human speech, the way in which we can never really know each other, communicate with each other. Language gets in the way. So doing truth in this world, in human language, is a constant attempt to circumnavigate those impossibilities of communication, that language just gets in the way, but you try and try and try not to let it get in the way, despite the fact that you know that it's only after death, when you have the chance to talk directly to God, that language is no longer going to be a problem. So that's what he's trying to do when he's doing truth, is striving towards truth in language. No wonder the Confessions is kind of complicated to read. And one of the things that indicates his profound preoccupation with language is that one of the ways he tells his own story is through language, through his own coming into language, through his, as it were, professionalization in language, and through his change of language mode. So these are three very important stages of the Confessions when you're thinking about them in terms of language. He's coming into language, he's professionalizing language, and then he's changing language mode. And for the next few minutes, I'll say what I mean by that before closing by giving an example of how he puts this into action. So handout number 3 is the description of himself, Augustine himself, as infant coming into language. And you may know that infant literally means not speaking. So he's moving from infancy, and he reflects on this too, that could be a whole other lecture. He's moving from infancy into boyhood, from infantia into pueritia. And he writes, I'll read this. "It was not that older people taught me by offering me words by way of formal instruction, as was the case soon afterwards with reading, another important mode of coming into language. But now we're talking about speaking. No," he says, "I taught myself using the mind you gave me, O my God. I grasped at words with my memory. When people called an object by some name, and while saying the word pointed to that thing, I watched, and I remembered that they used that sound when they wanted to indicate that thing. In this way, I gradually built up a collection of words, observing them as they were used in their proper places in different sentences, and hearing them frequently. Thus, I learned to express my needs to the people among whom I lived, and they made their wishes known to me." So notice the way, there's nothing else like this, I may say, in ancient literature. No one else describes the process of learning to speak like this. This is Augustine's observation combined with his extraordinary philosophical imagination at this point. And it is it not, that it's the passage that Wittgenstein riffs off at the beginning of philosophical investigations, though he, I would say, underestimates what Augustine's doing in this passage. Two really important things. So he's grasping at words with his memory. The words are repeated. People are indicating what they're talking about, or he's watching and remembering. But there are three, Monty Python moment, 3 really important things about this. One is, it's not just someone points to something and they name it, and he thinks, oh yeah, that's what that is. You know, this is a lectern, that's a table. It's that the words are strung together in context. He makes that really clear. He's talking about observing the words as they were used in their proper places in different sentences. So it's this very integrated notion of language acquisition. That's thing one. Thing two, notice that it is also completely embodied. It is about speaking, gesturing, voice production. It's all taking place in the body. That's incredibly important for Augustine in the Confessions, in his life, in his thought. That's a whole other lecture too. But how he emphasizes embodiment from here, right at the beginning of the Confessions, 1:8-13 is the reference for this. How he emphasizes embodiment anticipates what he'll do in the course of the Confessions with lived experience and ultimately with creation, and the way in which creation, not just human bodies, but all bodies, link the human being back to God. So, it's in context. The language is in context in sentences. It's embodied, and it is fundamentally social as well. It's being developed in conversation with others. It's not an isolated account of how he came into language. There are people all around him. He has needs, but they have needs too, and they're communicating with each other. So you see, that's one way. So you see, I'm trying to suggest ways into the Confessions for you, and that's one way in, is to think of Augustine as a human being among other human beings, always thinking through that sociality, that embodied sociality. Now, language, Augustine's language, part 2, I talked about the professionalization of language. Language was Augustine's career. It was his life. It was his life before the moment in the garden in Milan, that moment of conversion, and it was his life after that too. Before the garden in Milan, he had been making his career through language. It is hard to overstate how important proficiency in Latin was particularly to an aspiring young man from the provinces like Augustine in the late Roman world, but to anyone for social advancement, for a prominent secular career, to write superbly in Latin, and above all, to speak superbly in Latin, was your pathway to advancement, to preferment, to being a gentleman in that society. And Augustine does that. He comes from this tiny little town in North Africa. His father, though Roman, is a fairly insignificant member of the local gentry. He's a member of the local council, but that's pretty small potatoes. And he comes up. He goes, as it were, to university in Carthage. That's the biggest center of language training in North Africa. It's one of the biggest centers in the Roman world. That's huge that he gets there from this small town. And that's due to his gifts, his preternatural gifts, above all with Latin. Then he's teaching at his own university in Carthage. Then he, as you know, moves across to Rome. He gets a bit fed up with the Carthage students. They're kind of rowdy and difficult. And he thinks, well, they'll be better in Rome, and they are until they all vanish at the end of term without paying him. So it's a relief when he's invited up to Milan, which is where the imperial court is, to become imperial rhetor. And this is what language can do for you in late antiquity. It can take you all the way, for secular language, it can take you all the way from a little town in the provinces to the heart of the imperial court. His main job there would have been composing speeches of praise for the emperor. And he's also continuing to teach. And this is basically as good as it gets. And that's what he lays aside, what he departs from when he makes this key, crucial turn to Christianity and subsequently decides to return to North Africa. But that's one type of professionalization of language behind him. There's another type ahead of him that he helps to invent, which is he spends the rest of his life preaching, of course. We have well over 800 sermons of Augustine that survive, never mind hundreds, possibly thousands, that don't. He writes, as you know, key doctrinal works. He also constantly engages in argument. His rhetorical skills don't go away. He's constantly debating people, but now those who are his opponents in or against orthodoxy. So his opponents in the church. So different type of professionalization of language, but language remains at the heart of what Augustine does. And he juxtaposes these two stages of language very nicely. And those are handout 5. I'm skipping 4 for time purposes. It's self-explanatory, I think, after what I've just been saying. So handout 5, in book 5 of the Confessions. I don't know whether you've noticed this, if you've got this far in the Confessions, but book 5 is framed by two figures. It starts with Faustus, the Manichaean, and it ends with Ambrose, bishop in Milan. And that book is the turning point between these two types of language, the language of of Augustine's secular career, the conventionally professionalized language, and the language that he will use for the rest of his life as a Christian, but which is, as I say, nonetheless still at the heart of his practice, of what he does. And I want to start. He comes into conversation with Faustus. At this point, Augustine, and this is in Rome, he's been a committed Manichaean for almost 10 years. And he's doubtful. He's a Manichaean hearer. He's never one of the absolute core group of the elect. But he keeps finding holes in Manichaean teachings. And Faustus is renowned for his grasp of Manichaean teachings. So he thinks, okay, I have a chance to talk to him. I'll go and ask him my questions, and he'll explain it, and it will finally make sense, because I so want this stuff to make sense. And this snippet, the first one on handout 5, is the description, or a digest of the description of his encounter with Faustus the Manichaean. He says, when I raised these points, all the things he was having problems with in Manichaeism, when I raised these points for consideration and discussion, Faustus refused, courteously enough, refused to answer. For he knew that he did not know about these matters, and he was not ashamed to admit it. He was not one of the talkative kind, of whom I had suffered many, who tried to teach me, but said nothing. What a warning to us all, or at least to a handful of the people in this room. The talkative kind who tried to teach me, but said nothing. The number one thing that Augustine gets out of this encounter with Faustus, and remember that what he says he's doing in the Confessions is doing truth. The number one thing he gets is how important it is, if you don't know, just to say you don't know. And that really is a mantra for teaching, actually. I'm sure you've all had the experience of asking a question of some professor, and they're kind of fudging it. And you think, give me a break. You know, just say no. Say, I don't know. I'll go and look it up. It's fundamental to learning to be able to say, I don't know. And that's what Faustus teaches Augustine, not at all what he came to learn. That reaches back. I've just given you in small print a puzzling little snippet from the very beginning of the Confessions, from Book 1. Do you remember? He says, after that at the end of that big opening prayer, he says, after saying all that, what have we said? My God, my life, my holy sweetness. What does anyone who speaks of you really say? Yet woe betide those who fail to speak of you, while the chatterboxes go on saying nothing. So that's doing truth again. You're trying to speak, but you're not chattering. When you have nothing to say, don't say it. Don't just chatter on. So that's what Faustus teaches Augustine at the beginning of Book 5. And then he goes to Milan. And unless you're reading really closely, you won't even realize that he's just got the job that he and his mother have been shooting for his entire life. That he's got this amazing job at the imperial court in Milan. And it's there that he encounters Bishop Ambrose, who is one of the most compelling and most philosophical, appealing to Augustine, most philosophical exponents of the scriptures at that moment. And as you see from the second larger print passage on handout 5, Augustine goes to listen to Ambrose, to listen to him preach with professional interest. So he's not listening to Ambrose preaching to see what he says about God. He's just going to see how good he is. With professional interest, I listened to Ambrose conducting disputes before the people, but my intention was not the right one. I was assessing his eloquence to see whether it matched its reputation. As I opened my heart to appreciate how skillfully he spoke, the recognition that he was speaking the truth crept in at the same time, though only by slow degrees. So that's the transition from the previous professionalization of language into he opens his heart and he begins to hear Scripture through Ambrose. And I expect you all know, but nonetheless, I'm going to draw your attention to it, the passage in Book 3. So now we're looping back in the Confessions, but not really back in time, for reasons I'll explain in a minute. The passage where he first encounters Scripture, he's 19. He's still being educated. And as you know, he hates it. He doesn't get it. It's a pretty rough translation. He will have been reading it in, a rough translation into Latin. But he says, I turned my attention to the Holy Scriptures to find out what they were like. What I see in them today is something not accessible to the scrutiny of the proud, nor exposed to the gaze of the immature. Something lowly as one enters, but lofty as one advances further, something veiled in mystery. At the time At the time, though, I was in no state to enter, nor prepared to bow my head and accommodate myself to its ways. My approach then was quite different from the one I am suggesting now, and so on. He noticed that in talking about his first encounter with the scriptures, he actually post-dates the response. He can't bear to say right away how horrible he found them. I turned my attention to the Holy Scriptures to find out what they were like. What I see in them today is, and then he goes back and says, then I was too proud. I couldn't approach them. My swollen pride recoiled from the style. My intelligence failed to penetrate its inner meaning. How humiliating for a person who's made his life, whose calling card is his intelligence. That's how he's getting out of his little town, is through his intelligence. Humiliating at the time, humbling later on. He needs to become humble. And yet another theme, it's even in these passages that I've chosen, but you'll see going through the Confessions, is the need for humility. How pride gets in the way. Language gets in the way, pride gets in the way. And look at the way he's describing it. He's describing it as if he's entering a temple through a low, low door. He's sort of crawling in now, and you have to bend down to get through that door. And when you get in, it's pretty dark. There's only a few things you can make out. That's how he's now encountering the scriptures. Now, 397, when he's been working hard with them for 10 years. He's been immersing himself. He's been trying to make out those images, having become humble enough to get in through that low door. And part of the uniqueness of the Confessions, I talked at the beginning that the Confessions is like nothing else. It truly is unique. It's unique even in English. I have to say it's even more unique in Latin. And part of its uniqueness is that Augustine develops a language of his own for the Confessions. Obviously, I don't mean he's writing in gobbledygook. He's still writing in Latin. But he's writing in a Latin that's not quite like anything else before or since, including anything else that he himself ever writes. I think he really is doing truth. There's something about this work. It's rather unscholarly and romanticizing of me to say, but there is something about this work that comes straight from the heart. That's why there couldn't be anything else like it in his opus, because nothing else he writes. There are other personal things, but nothing else he writes is ever quite that personal. It's never torn so directly from his experience, from his thoughts, from a very particular moment in time and development. So he invents this more or less unique language, and it is interwoven with scriptural language. As I've said before, you hardly know where Augustine ends and scripture begins. This is the achieved result of this conversation with God through the scriptures. And that's why his encounter with the scriptures is so important. So the reason you have this chunk of both Latin and English in number 7 in the handout is not that I suddenly expect you all to learn Latin, but that I just want to give you some sense of this. And remember, I said language is his life. Embodied language is incredibly important to him. The sociality of language is incredibly important to him. Language is something done between people. It's not something done in isolation. It's always about communication and conversation and the emergent attempt at doing truth. What I'm going to do is read a bit of this in Latin. You can follow along in English and just talk a little about what he's doing to make it distinctive. It's from the very beginning of the Confessions, the second paragraph of the Confessions, that opening prayer to God. And incidentally, those marks, those accents over the Latin, that's nothing to do with Latin as such. That's to give, should you wish to try to read this aloud, so you know where to place the emphases in the words. Et quomodo invocabo Deum meum, Deum et Dominum meum, quoniam utique in me ipsum eum vocabo, cum invocabo eum. Et quis locus est in me, quo veniat in me Deus meus, quo Deus veniat in me, Deus, qui fecit caelum et terram. Itane, Domine Deus meus, est quicquam in me, quod capiat te. Anvero caelum et terra, quae fecisti, et in quibus me fecisti, capiunt te. Anquias sine te non esset quidquid est, fit quidquid est, capiat te. Quoniam itaque et ego sum, quid peto ut venias in me, qui non essem, nisi esses in me. I'm going to stop there. It's about 2/3 of the way down that passage, if you have it in front of you. Even if you don't know Latin, what you get there is a sense of the passion of the invocation, of the way he's using repetition. Deum meum, Deum et Dominum meum. That means my God and my Lord. And then he repeats Deus again. At the end of the lines, he's putting me and te, me and you, right at the beginning. We know this is a conversation between Augustine and God. He has these very short, very insistent, both words and phrases. Latin, as those of you who have tried Latin will know, is not a language of either short words or short phrases. It's a language of polysyllables and of incredibly long, convoluted phrases. This is all part of what Augustine's creating in this attempt to do truth. In fact, it was only this afternoon when I was thinking about this presentation and what I was going to say this evening that I realized Augustine has achieved with this work a sort of image of what he thinks about God. That may seem an extraordinary thing to make, a claim to make. But at the beginning of Book 5, Augustine asks, Lord, who is like you? And he asks that again at the beginning of Book 8 and again at the beginning of Book 9. Lord, who is like you? And of course the implied answer is, nothing is like you. You know, I can try and try and try to say what God is like. That's what he's doing in all the paradoxes of that prayer right at the beginning. He's reaching towards God. But nothing is like God. And he's somehow in an earthly, in a human, in a mortal way, managed to produce in language an image of that. He's produced a work that nothing else is like. What is like the Confessions? Nothing. And I'll leave you with that thought for now. But you're welcome to ask questions, of course. I'm assuming there's a question. A few questions. Some brave volunteers. Or not, it's fine. Yes.